Yep, as Pat said, I'm the owner of Watercolors Aquarium Gallery, where we focus on aquariums not just as glass boxes where we can keep things alive in, but also a living and breathing work of art. So what is it that makes an aquarium cool? It's all about the composition of the aquarium, or how we use the ingredients, the basic ingredients that we have at our disposal, in just the right way to add aesthetics and beauty to the ecosystem that we're creating. So first, the first part of those ingredients, those ingredients would be hardscape, livestock, and plants. Those are the three main things we're going to put into the tank, put into this tank here, that we're going to use to work together to make an aesthetically beautiful aquarium. So first, the hardscape. When we're talking about with hardscape is rocks, driftwood, things like that. When we're using hardscapes, we want those hardscapes to be uniformed, we want them to be balanced, and we want them to be contrasting. So I'm going to tell a funny story here for a minute. So when I was doing a search for the right pictures to use for examples of not the greatest aquascapes, I found these really cool, this whole website full of this one company that used these aquascapes that just all of the quote unquote rules about aquascaping, they broke all of those rules. I'm like, wow, this is great. This is like a whole big mess of pictures I can use for the talk. So I went and I traveled to a different club and I gave the talk at that club and had those pictures and used, here's an example of what not to do. The owner of that company was sitting in the audience. It was a little funny. Yeah. Fortunately, he took it. We had a nice laugh about it. The reason that I tell that story is because just because someone is a professional doesn't necessarily mean that they can put the right ingredients together and have it great. So you see the tank on the left, that is something that I'm using as an example of, they have a bunch of hardscape in there, but the hardscape doesn't work together very well at all, right? It's just a mishmash of a bunch of different rocks that there's nothing natural about the way those rocks work together. There's no balance. There's contrast, but there's no balance, there's no composition, there's no uniformity to the way that layout is done. The bottom right is an example of, there's hardscape. The rocks are it's all the same kind of rock. So that gives it that uniformity to it, that gives it that intent and that composition that you get if you're just using one kind of rock. The one above that has two types of hardscape in it, and they're very contrasting hardscape. So you've got those really long flowing lines out of those pieces of driftwood contrasting with the rocks down on the bottom. And that kind of contrast is great with two of them. With a whole bunch of them, it just turns into a jarbled mess. Livestock. So you can get into the same kind of discussion when it comes to livestock. I remember stocking my first 10-gallon aquarium as a child and walking into the pet store, and they happened to be having a half-off sale on all their fish. And I went running up and down the aisles and picking one of these and picking one of these and picking one of these, and they were all fish that I really liked and really enjoyed, but when you put them in a tank together, they don't look like they belong there, right? They don't look like a uniform composition with the livestock. The tank on the right, it's a whole big group of angelfish. It's just that one kind of fish, and that all of a sudden looks like it belongs there. So it adds to, rather than just detracts from, the aquascape. So that's not to say that you just have to have one kind of fish in your aquarium, but for example, an excellent aquascape is 25 tuxedo platies and a pair of dwarf cichlids at the bottom. And those 25 tuxedo platies, all that same look, that gives it that uniform composition. Then you can also add to that some of the organisms that help us maintain that aquarium, things like a monoshrimp and autocinclus, and add to the ecosystem in the tank, but then also go back to, is it going to be clean? Let's get a little help with some of the organisms to do that. So not one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these, but pick one large group, pick your favorite group of tetra, your favorite resbora, rainbow fish, put a big group of those in, add a couple of accent fish, but do it with purpose and do it with intent. Plants. With plants, we can do a little bit more of that. I like one of these, and I like one of these, and I like one of these, as long as it's done with a little bit of a purpose and a little bit of intent. And I don't know what it is visually, why it's okay for us to see a whole mix of plants and have that work, but to see a whole mix of fish and have it seem like it's garbled. The only thing that I can come up with is what our eyes are used to, a natural landscape, when we see a meadow or when we see a beautiful forest with a beautiful scene, we're going to see a whole bunch of different kinds of plants in that scene. And somehow that draws us in and that works. To take that analogy a little bit further, if we're seeing something like that in the mountains or we're seeing some of that in a rocky area, we're going to see the same type of rock in there, but we're not necessarily going to see the same type of plants. So some contrast is going to be okay. Some decisions to be made when you are picking the plants for that is you have to decide what kind of hobbyist are you and what kind of dedication do you want to have to this planet aquarium. A lot of you have probably heard the difference between a low-tech tank and a high-tech tank. And essentially what we're talking about there is on a high-tech tank, it's going to have CO2, it's going to have more light, it's going to need a lot more fertilization. On a low-tech tank, really fertilization's not going to be completely necessary, and we're going to skip the CO2 on that. So at that point, when you're doing aquascape, you need to choose plants that are going to fit in line with low-tech, high-tech. How much care are you going to want to give it? When I aquascape this tank today, it's all going to be aquascaped as a low-tech tank. All of these plants can be used and grown well without any kind of a CO2 system. Contrast, just like with hardscape, is important when choosing plants. And some of the plants can work really, really well together. So plants that have really nice, long, slender leaves, like a Valsinaria, contrasted with something like a Cryptoblasii or some of the tiger lotus, something that has a big, round leaf. The contrast of those two plants can really look well together, as long as they're laid out with intent and purpose. All right, so equipment. Equipment is the next step. I am a huge fan of canister filters on a Planet Aquarium. Not that you can't use a hang-in-the-back filter on a Planet Aquarium, that they can work very, very well. But every time I set up a Planet Aquarium, I'm always going to put a canister filter on that tank. And the reason is that we want that gas exchange that's going to happen in that Planet Aquarium to happen on the leaves of the plants, not at the surface. A hang-on-the-back filter has that waterfall effect, and they work great for any tank that we're not going to be using live plants as the source of oxygen. But if live plants are going to be our main source of oxygen and our focus, then we want to keep that gas exchange happening on their leaves. So with a canister filter, you can put the output below the water surface, and even if you get a little bit of that surface film on top, that's okay. That can hold those gases in and keep that oxygen exchange happening on the leaves of the plants. There have been studies done to determine just how much oxygen is produced by plants. And two tanks side by side, one with the hang-on-the-back overflow, or with a hang-on-the-back filter with that cascading effect, sitting right next to a fully planted aquarium that had a little bit of surface film, but had really, really nice plant growth. The tank with the plant growth actually had a higher oxygen concentration than the tank that just had the cascading filter. So oxygen isn't something to be concerned with when you get that surface tension, as long as you have that good plant growth. The other thing about equipment is keep it out of the way. I chose these two aquascapes because they're fairly similar aquascapes. But the top right, although it does have a little bit growing out to do, that's going to probably turn out to be a pretty cool looking aquarium once it's trimmed and maintained a little bit. But the first thing your eyes catch is that big old filter hanging out in the background. It's really a distraction from what could be a beautiful little aquascape. Whereas on the bottom left here, they were very intentional about putting all of the equipment out of the way. So you can't always hide equipment completely, but anything you can do to hide that equipment, to keep that away from a distraction in your aquascape, the equipment is very important in that. All right, so let's get into the layout rules, or guidelines, if you will, right? These would be some of those things that help us determine why we're going to place something in a certain spot, right? So the three ones I'm going to talk about today is something called the golden ratio, the 1/3, 2/3 spacing, which actually is another, simplifying the golden ratio a little bit, and then no centering. Don't center anything. All right, so first let's talk about the golden ratio. So the golden ratio was originally officially described by the ancient Greeks, but it even starts to show up in some of the artwork of the ancient Egyptians. So it's a concept that goes back a very, very, very long time. You've possibly also heard it described as related to the Fibonacci sequence. All of those things are related. And what that essentially is talking about is the ratio of proportion that our eyes, our brain perceives as aesthetically pleasing, right? So the reason an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper is those dimensions. That's very, very intentional. That uses the golden ratio. This aquarium right here, it uses the golden ratio. The reason a 29-gallon aquarium is shaped this way is because it has that. A 20 high has that. A 90-gallon tank has that. It's got that ratio that for some reason, and it's not completely understood why, but our brains say, ah, that looks good. Another aspect that okay, so the golden ratio, let's talk about that a little bit further. Essentially, it's a 5/8 ratio. So a 5/8 measurement would be an easy way to think of that golden ratio. Anytime you expand or contract that, the numbers would expand or contract accordingly to that 5/8 ratio. We can even use that so far as how we determine placement and the number of things that go in our aquarium. You may have noticed that I've intentionally put 8 rocks in here, 2 very uniform, unique piles. In the back, you can, I know it's a little hard to see in the back, but there's 8 rocks, and some of you maybe walked in and looked at it and went, 2 real uniform, uniform piles of rocks, one on each side, kind of look centered. It doesn't, aesthetically, that doesn't do anything for us. But if we take one of those rocks and simply put it on the other pile, all of a sudden, that has that ratio. So not only can we use the golden ratio in determining placement, but also number of things that go into an aquarium. So now I've got the 5/8 rule working with my hardscape as well. Use that with planting, use that with rocks. Simply put, if you're going to put 8 of something in your tank, don't put 4 on one side and 4 on the other. Put 5 on one side and 3 on the other. Try it when you get home or when you get in front of an aquarium. Just move stuff around, and you'll notice that as soon as you have that ratio, it's going to look better. Your brain is going to say, ah, that is an aesthetically pleasing thing to look at. No centering. This one here, it's another one from that same company. But you can see that pile of rocks just comes up to a point. It doesn't, nothing about that, it just doesn't look right. It doesn't look natural. So if we go back to our pile of rocks here, I apologize for the noise that it's going to make when I clank them on the bottom. If we take that pile of rocks and we put them right in the center, same thing. It doesn't do it. It looks funny. It looks like it was just set there. Our brains, for some reason, want to put things in the middle. If we move things off just a little bit, immediately that looks more like something. Start to look at some of the famous portrait photography or some of the Ansel Adams photography or even some of the ancient art, and you'll notice the eyes, which is what our eyes are drawn to, they are in many of those photographs or in many of those pieces of art, the eyes are right at that 5/8 mark, just off of center. The other 2 aquariums I put in there to kind of push that concept a little bit further, the top tank and the bottom tank are fairly similar aquascapes. They have a fairly similar intent. They're both pretty cool looking aquariums, but if you notice the top tank, the focal point of that aquarium, it's right in the middle. And to me, that's not as strong as a composition as the tank below that. So don't put anything in the middle. Here's some more examples of how the aquarium artists used that proportion very, very intentionally. So the top one there, that tree, that's obviously the focus point. If we would take a ruler out, we would probably see that it is exactly at that 5/8 mark. Now something you'll notice, whether that 5/8 is starting from the left side or from the right side, it really doesn't matter. Either side is just fine. The bottom one shows that, the path as a focus point that draws your eye right down, right at that 5/8 mark. And then what they've also done is the way that these trees are set up, one of those trees is about 5/8 the size or the thickness of the other tree, and it just works with your eyes. So that also shows a little bit about the 1/3, 2/3 rule, which really is just kind of simplifying 5/8 and 3/8, right? Which essentially is the same kind of ratio, just from a different side. The 1/3, 2/3 rule just kind of simplifies the idea so that we don't have to get out a measuring tape and see exactly where that 5/8 mark is, where if you got the 1/3 or 2/3, you're going to be really, really close. So that's a great way to think of in an aquarium where you want 2 focus points, or you got 2 favorite plants and you really want to use both of those plants in the aquarium. Putting them at that 1/3 and that 2/3 spot works as long as one of them is about 5/8 the size of the other one. If both of those things are exactly the same size and you put one at 1/3 and one at 2/3, it's really going to look like you've essentially centered something, and it's not going to be as strong of a composition. So that 5/8 size difference really works. Even if you're going funky, that top tank is kind of a funky kind of look. Some of us might look and go, it's a little kind of weird. But that path just off center, right about at that 5/8 mark, makes it so that it's a visually appealing composition. Bottom tank as well. That path off center draws your eye into that aesthetically pleasing point. Any questions about that? All right. So, references. One of the great ways to decide how you want your aquarium to look, go look at a bunch of aquariums. Go look at a bunch of pictures of aquariums to get ideas, to get that inspiration. Just simply Google the word Aquascape, hit on images, and you're going to see thousands and thousands of really, really cool tanks to inspire you. The Aquatic Gardeners Association, if you go look at their website, every year they hold a huge international aquascaping competition. And they have hundreds and hundreds of entries with all kinds of different categories and themes and things like that. Check out their site to get some ideas. The Aquarium Design Group is a service company out of Houston, Texas. They are amazing aquascapers. If you take a look at their site, they've got some really nice, some really basic ideas. And because they are a service company, their ideas need to be a little bit more simple to maintain. So to get some good ideas of some aquariums that many of them are going to be on the lower tech side or more easily maintained side, that's a great one. And then I would be remiss to mention the word aquascaping without mentioning the name Takashi Amano. Takashi was really one of the first people to present the idea, to really make popular the idea that we can use an aquarium as a work of art. Unfortunately, we lost Takashi a couple of years ago. But if you Google Takashi Amano, you're going to see some just amazing inspirational ideas of some beautiful aquariums. He was an aquarium artist out of Japan. Had a service company out there and things like that as well. So yeah, Takashi Amano, Google any of those, get a lot more ideas. All right, so let's move on and let's start doing an aquascape. So as I do the aquascape, I'm hoping that you can see back there enough. I'm going to demonstrate some of the cool little techniques, some of the tips and tricks for making moss stick and putting things where you want them and getting the layout just the way you want it. And like I said, this is all going to be low-tech, easy plants, easy growing things. So there'll be some pausing in here while I'm trying to get stuff shifted. Feel free to get a little closer if you want to. Shout out some questions about what I'm doing. Any of that stuff is just fine. Don't worry, I won't bang too many rocks around in the bottom of that tank for much longer. Anybody have any questions as I'm moving on to the next part here? Okay, so one of the things I'm going to do with this aquascape, if you see these tanks here, where they've got a lighter sand up front, but still amazing plant growth. That's not growing plants in a poor substrate. That's a divided substrate. So they've got some kind of a good plant growth substrate behind those. Something like an Eco-Complete or Seachem's fluorite or Fluval stratum. I often get asked the question, so which one's the best? Man, we have too many good choices for me to choose which one's the best. Today I'm going to use Eco-Complete because it's the least dusty of all of those. The Seachem fluoride is often one that I use for aquascapes, but Seachem fluoride has got to be rinsed and rinsed and rinsed and rinsed and rinsed. It grows plants really, really well. It's a little bit of a heavier substrate, so if you're trying to anchor plants, fluoride does a really good job of that. Eco-Complete is a little bit on the heavier side as well, so that really helps for holding down plants while their roots get established. Fluval stratum and now Denali has some good stuff out there as well. It's really good stuff, but it's a little bit harder to work with because it's a softer, lighter substrate. Root growth, I think maybe is going to happen a little better with those substrates, but getting the plants to anchor, sometimes it takes a little bit of extra time. So in this one, the way that they do that divided substrate, we're going to do a path on this one as well. So quite simply, we're going to take some of this cardboard, and this is just a poster board that we ran down to Myra at the last minute and picked up. I'm going to use some rocks and some tape to kind of determine placement on how we want that poster board to sit. Putting a couple of folds in it. And I am going to put a path in this one. And of course that path is not going to be in the middle. Rocks do a great job of holding dividers in place. I've used tape, I've used rocks, anything like that will work. Anything you can do to temporarily hold that cardboard in place, remembering that that cardboard does not have to be there for very long. Just something to keep your soils, keep your substrates from mixing. And the goal is not only that you want to keep them from mixing the whole time, but as you're filling, the weight is going to push on that cardboard. So you want to kind of maneuver those rocks and work them slowly. I'm going to start out with, let's start with Eco-Complete. Now as I'm filling that in, what? I'm sorry?
Eco-Complete.
Eco-Complete.
Okay.
Black. Yep. Eco-Complete comes in 3 or 4 different colors at this point. This is the black. And I chose that because those were the bags that were most accessible when I was walking out of the shop the other day. Very careful choice there. So here's one of those little tricks retailers don't want you to know. The cosmetic sand is what they call it online, like this big fancy word, it's cosmetic sand. It's pool filter sand. Yeah, it was $50 or 50 pounds for $8. So it's really, it's not expensive stuff, but it gives that nice light. If it mixes a little bit underneath, that's not a big deal. We want to keep that separation happening up at the top. And again, I'm just kind of filling that in, filling them both in so that I can keep maneuvering that cardboard just a little bit and keep it from mixing. I like to do it with 2 separate scoops. That way you don't get the little black pieces to show up like that one just did right there. Having the white stuff in the black is not as big of a deal because we're going to plant the black stuff pretty thickly. You're really not even going to be able to see much of the black substrate at all. When we finish the front, you want that line to be very, very even and very, very smooth. A solid straight line. Looks more intentional. Looks like your composition was purposeful than if it's a little bit jagged. Smooth that out a little bit, make sure it's pretty close to even. Voila. There you go. These have been pre-soaked, which make it much, much easier to get them to sink. And I gotta remember exactly how I had this. You know, taking a picture of it beforehand would have been really smart. I'm not that smart. All right, so my goal here is I'm gonna create a little bit of a tunnel effect with the 2 pieces of driftwood. Right, so the path at that mark is gonna go right through that tunnel. Using some dragonstone, that's going to hide that edge. All right, so nice pieces of valsinaria here. A good long planting tweezers helps a lot with getting plants in where you want them. And I've got about 8 clumps of valsinaria. So particularly when you're planning for a live bear aquarium, plant it thick. Put a lot of plants in there, and the good thick growing plants, that's what really the reason we want to use live plants in a live bear aquarium is two reasons, right? We want to hide, we want to give cover for a mate that might be harassed, and we want to provide cover for the fry. So if you plant it thick, even in an aquascape, it can provide both of those things and still have a good aesthetically pleasing feel to it. So I'm just going to create a nice thick wall, and I'm just gently shoving the root, the base of the plant, into the substrate. So when your goal is to create an aquascape, I have people come to the shop all the time, and I'm just setting up a new tank, I want that plant and that plant. If you're going to go do an aquascape and you're going to put $100 worth of fish in it, don't put $5 worth of plants in it, right? Start out at the beginning with a nice, big, thick bunch of plants, with the plants that you want. Aquascape it with intent from the start. And aquascape it with it dry, with the way that we're doing it here. But if you start out with a whole bunch of plants at the beginning, you're going to have a healthier, fuller, and more intentional aquascape the whole time.
Do you have recommendations for sourcing the plants?
So I'm a shop local kind of guy. So my first recommendation is talk to your local store. If they don't have what you want, ask them to get it. If they can't, then go ahead and start sourcing it elsewhere. I'm not a big box guy, but that's because I own a local shop. And remember that local shop owner either is or at one point was a dedicated hobbyist like we are, who turned it into a business. So having somebody come in the store with an interest in something new might make them want to reach out and source plants for you. If not, there's lots of really good online vendors out there. I don't shop at them, so I couldn't recommend one to you. Aquarium Rush. Hopefully soon we'll have live plants on Aquarium Rush. We just don't yet. I believe Corey has live plants on his site.
Yep, we sell lots.
Co-op. Check out his stuff. But again, if it can be sourced locally, sourcing locally is good. Some things to look for when you're looking at a website or when you're looking at a store as to whether or not they're going to have good quality plants. A really good indicator is what kind of plants are they carrying. If they have a lot of the plants that are sold as aquatic plants but really are terrarium plants and don't belong in an aquarium, things like the palms and the lucky bamboos. If a store is selling those or a website is selling those as, hey, this will be great in your aquarium, probably move on to the next store. Or maybe even better yet, talk to the store and say, hey, maybe you guys don't know this, but are you open to the idea of talking about good plants that your customers can keep alive for a long time? That kind of interaction with store owners goes one of two ways, right? See how it goes, and if it goes right, you can really make a difference in the store. If it goes wrong, find a new store. All right, so the next plants I'm going to add is a really nice contrasting plant. It's called Cryptoblasii. Similar name to Balancea, but much different plant. It's got a really nice purple hue to it. And I'm going to do the same kind of thing with that one because it's a bigger plant and we're going to run out of space here pretty quick. So I'm going to do 3 of those on one side and I'm going to do 2 of those on the other. And that contrasting leaf next to the Balancea and next to the Vallisneria, I think just that really deep purple, I think just looks really, really cool. We're going to do pronounce that one? Blasii. Blasii, I believe. All right, so the next plants I'm going to add to this is Cryptwentai. You know what? Let me just stare at this for a minute. Yeah, we're going to put some Cryptwentai in. Cryptwentai is not going to get as tall as the Blasii. This is Wentai red. So it's got that good purple hue to it as well. It grows pretty nice and thick. We're going to use that kind of as our gate to our little path here. I've got one of them that's about 5/8 the size of the other one.
How frequently are the water changes on those tanks?
What's that?
How frequently are the water changes on those tanks?
I pay people to do it, so pretty regularly.
Are you getting value from money?
That's the other half.
Well,
Okay, that's what you think.
that does help. All right, so these little Sagittarias can be a little bit tedious to place. We're going to get those guys right up front, and those are going to grow in with the rocks. Sagittaria is one of those plants that I found if it gets all the light it wants, it stays fairly short and spreads really well. If it's a little light on light, then it's going to grow up taller and not necessarily, and then have the potential for crowding some of your plants behind it. If you want tall Sagittaria, that's not a problem.
How do you kill the snails?
I love snails, so I don't kill snails.
What if you didn't like snails?
So here's my spiel. I got a spiel on just about everything. Here's my spiel on snails. We get people coming in the time, I have a plague of snails in my tank. The answer to that is you're feeding too much. I love that. That was awesome. Nothing can reproduce beyond its resources. You are its resources. So if the snails are reproducing like crazy, it's because they have so much to eat they get to make lots and lots of babies. Right?
I don't know if that's true for Malaysian trumpet snails, though.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with those guys.
Yeah.
Definitely with those guys. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to reproduce in your tank. They're still going to reproduce. But if they're reaching that plague proportion, that's because they're getting plenty to eat. Feed less. Malaysian trumpet snails to me do a great job of turning that substrate over a little bit. They keep detritus from building up too much. I'm a fan of snails in an aquarium. Okay, so here's the really fun part about doing an aquascape when it's empty. Filling it up can be really scary sometimes. On purpose. I have both won an aquascaping contest and lost an aquascaping contest because of the way I filled or the other person filled their tank, right? We used fluorite in one of the scapes we did, and I happened to fill it up really, really slow and careful, and the person I was competing against didn't. If you can't see an aquascape, you can't judge an aquascape, right? So I won. So the next year, I didn't fill it up carefully enough, or the fluorite we were using was dustier, and you couldn't see my aquascape. So I lost. So that's part of the reason why I'm using EcoComplete on that one, and part of the reason why I'm having Justin here, so that I can really fill this very, very slowly. All right, so let's go ahead and fire it up and see what happens. Yep, I'm using my hand. Turn it off a minute. All right, fortunately, I brought a pump with a valve. We're just gonna get that way down. The beginning is the scariest part. Go ahead. Is the scariest part. There we go. Now we're just gonna trickle that in nice and slow. I'm diffusing that with my hand. Doing what we can to stop the washout. That's happening a little bit there.
Have you ever tried using like a plastic bag or like a colander?
I have, but I forgot one. Plastic bag is a good idea. Turn off for just a minute. Thanks for the reminder. I'm like, dang it, I don't have. I often use like a little a plexiglass or acrylic top. And think about it. We're using a big bag. Thanks, John. That's perfect. That's going to make that a little bit easier. And don't worry, I have just the tool for taking care of that. All right, one more time here. There we go. John saves the day. This is another one of the aquascaping tools that I use that the first time I saw it, I thought, come on, what are you going to use that for, right? Turns out I use this thing all the time. I've got actually two varieties. One of them has more of a claw to it, and this one's got the nice flat edge. So this is what we're going to use to kind of shape the soil, and because we got a little bit of the black stuff ended up into the white stuff a little bit, I'm going to use that just as a spade to smooth out that line, and we're just going to scoop that black stuff out of there best that we can. The three tools that I use the most in an aquascape are the scissors, a big long scissors with a curved end, although I use that more for trimming stem plants after the tank has been set up for a while. You saw me use that tweezers. I use those things constantly. And then this soil spade. All right, fluffing out some Valsinaria. Fluffing out some other plants here. Any other questions while we're going? All right. If my head's down and you got a question, just shout it out. Get those all fluffed up. Come around to the front here a minute. Get those things set a little bit better.
You've been here close on time. Can we do the raffle while you're finishing up?
Absolutely.
All right, let's do door prizes.